So we've done, as I was saying, we've done 3 topics, 2 in Hebrew, 1 in English. On Sunday night, the English topic was the year 1927. What happened that year? And of course, as is typical of Jews, especially this particular Jew, we went back about 20 years before. It took so much time building up, we never got to the point. But we talked about Ayin Aleph, how the Rebbe Rashab said in 1910, when his mother told him that you don't feel well, he said, mir is gut, mir is gor gut. Halavai soll Yosef Yitzchak sein as a good. I have it good, I have it very good. I wish my son should have it so good. In 1910. And we journeyed through the early years of the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe's Nesius, and we talked about Taka, the year of his arrest, Peizayin, and so forth. The second hour of Sunday night we did in Hebrew, and the topic was the previous Rebbe's childhood. I told a lot of stories about the Rebbe's childhood, and the hardships the Rebbe had. The Rebbe had a very unusual childhood. On the one hand, it was such a peaceful, wonderful childhood. On the other hand, he didn't have parents. His father was sick so much, and his parents traveled so frequently that to a great extent he was raised by his grandmother. I mean, she wasn't a terrible person to be raised by, but it was still interesting. And the last hour, we started in English and we shifted to Hebrew as the Hebrew speakers showed up, or I should say the non-English speakers showed up. We talked about the Rebbe über der Welt, which is a slogan, a theme, which appears in some sichos. The idea that the Rebbe's coming to the United States marked a change in his own self-identity. That rather than be a Rebbe over Hasidim, which was the traditional role of a Rebbe, he became the Rebbe over the whole world. The remaining topic, what we're going to do now, is 55 years of Mesiras Nefesh for Askanas Tziburis, 55 years of self-sacrifice for public service. Remember, the previous Rebbe only lived 70 years. Now, even though I went to Ola Teire, 70 minus 55 equals 15. That means to say, in simple words, the previous Rebbe became a public person on his 15th birthday. And the story that revolves around this event of his becoming a public person on his 15th birthday is extremely dramatic. It's a very powerful story. And I copied the sichos. I'm going to we're going to study the story together. It's a very, very compelling and emotionally intense story of a father who takes his 15-year-old son and essentially sacrifices him on the altar of worrying about Jewish people. It's a very powerful story. But I want to begin the class with the end, with the last page. These stacks that I'm giving you are for you to keep, page 17. I printed a lot of pages. I know full well that I cannot read all these pages with you, but we're going to jump around, read bits and pieces of it, and I would encourage you, if you're not uncomfortable with Hebrew, to read some more of it on your own, because it's quite compelling. In 1945, the war ended. The war was ending. The previous Rebbe, for those who do not know, had a stroke that summer when he heard what happened to Hasidim. He was out of commission for a few weeks, and it affected him very deeply, as it would affect anybody. When I was preparing today's class, I was leafing through pages, and I came across a letter from the previous Rebbe. That's a lament for the Holocaust. It's gut-wrenching. The Rebbe schreibt in his Shomeis, in this letter, the pain that is communicated, is conveyed in this letter, how, so many of us were killed, and look what's doing with the survivors. Very bitter. Our Rebbe, the Rebbe Zal Gesundsein, who was then called Ramash, the son-in-law of the previous Rebbe, and all of the Beis Harav had nicknames. So the Rebbe's first name is Mem, and his Shin is Sheerson. So he was called Ramash, worked hand in hand with the previous Rebbe naturally, and he loved the Frierdiker Rebbe infinitely, and he worried about the previous Rebbe. So he made an initiative, and I actually looked through the Rebbe's Igis and I couldn't find it, so I didn't prepare it. He made an initiative, and the initiative was that as many people as possible should write to the previous Rebbe. That's the middle Rebbe he sat down on. You can sit there, should write to the previous Rebbe to congratulate him on 50 years of public service and to show appreciation for what he's done and to ask him to continue doing more. And the Rebbe made a whole letter writing campaign from all over the world, from Israel, from Europe. The catch was the previous Rebbe was not allowed to know that it came from the Rebbe, because if it came from the Rebbe, the point was defeated. And hundreds of Jews of all different types and stripes wrote the Rebbe telegrams and letters on Yud Beis Tammuz of that year, Tafshin Hey, 1945, to acknowledge 50 years of service of Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Rashab was 65 at that point. And there were a number of campaigns that the Rebbe made, all with the same intent, to push it, give the Frierdiker Rebbe a bisel nachas. That was the point. It's not complicated. And it seems that it was effective. It seems, although, like I told you before, I was looking for 2 letters that I didn't find. I spent some time researching the class, and I was looking for a letter from the previous Rebbe where he acknowledges the receipt of these congratulations. And I was also looking for a letter from the Rebbe where he's encouraging Hasidim to send these congratulations. I saw these letters with my eyes sometime in my past, hopefully not in my imagination, but I couldn't find them. I looked through the Iggyas, looked through the index, I looked in the originals, I looked in the supplements, I didn't find them. But there are letters that bring forward this idea that in 1945, when the Rebbe turned 65, the Rebbe, our Rebbe, created a whole tnu'ah, a whole movement that people should congratulate the Frierdiker Rebbe for his sacrifice for Klal Yisrael. And one of those campaigns was a gift that Hasidim in America gave the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe. And the gift was that they were going to print his Hasidus, what she said in the United States. There was very little money around, especially in 1945. And Hasidim gave their mamish, their traveling money, their train money, their nickels and their dimes, to become partners in this effort to print the Hasidus of the Rebbe as Hasidim's gift to the Rebbe in honor of his 65th birthday and in honor of 50 years of public service. So I printed this pidyon, this page. You see this page? This is the page. You open up a book, you see this page, you skip it. But it's actually interesting, and I'm one of those geeks who reads the pages most people skip. So I want... Don't insult me, okay? When I insult myself, it's okay. That's right. You're not allowed to laugh. But in any case, I want to read with you this piece of paper because I think it's very compelling. So, Baruch Hashem, you see where I'm reading? It's on page 17. All the pages are numbered by me on the bottom. Page 17, the last page of the stack on the right side. Baruch Hashem, Yud, Aleph, Tammuz, Hey, Tov, Shin, Hey. This is one day before Yud Beis Tammuz, 1945, which was then the 65th birthday of the previous Rebbe. It was 50 years since he became a public servant, as we're going to see soon. And it was 18 years since his liberation from the prison. So the Rebbe writes like this. Shalom Ebracha, Kveid Kedushas Admoir Shlita, written to the Rebbe. Shalom Ebracha, greetings and blessings. Harashum Mata, the undersigned. Poinim Bazeh Lekveid Kedushas Admoir Shlita, are turning herein, through this, to the Rebbe Shlita, Bebakashas Amalavovis, with a very heartfelt request. Lekabel, that he should accept. LeYud Beis Tammuz Hey Tov Shnei, to the coming Yud Beis Tammuz, which would be the next day, 1945, which is Chag HaMeshulish. It's a triple Yom Tov. There's 3 Yom Tovs of Yud Beis Tammuz. Number 1, Sheyeh Muledes, Kveid Kedushas Admor Shlita. It was the birthday of the Frierdiker Rebbe. He turned 65 that day. Number 2, Yom Cheirusei Mimasa, the day he was redeemed from prison 18 years before, in 1927. And number 3, V'yoyim Melois Chamishim Shana, the day that completes the 50 years, Mehascholas Avedasa Akadesha, from the beginning of his holy work, Binyanei Klal, in matters of community. And I want you to understand that the topic that I really want to show you is how the Rebbe Rashab raised the Frierdiker Rebbe. It was completely not normal. Completely not. First of all, when the Rebbe was a kid, the father wasn't even around. Then when the Rebbe got a little older, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, he became so close to his son. I mean, you'll see the letters, the sikhs. The Rebbe Rashab used to leave Lubavitch and disappear for weeks at a time for one reason, to spend time with his son alone. And when his son became 15 years old, he literally sacrificed him to the Jewish nation. He just gave him away. His son acquiesced, his son agreed, but it was he didn't exactly have two choices, you understand. A life of sacrifice for Jewish people from the age of 15 years old. Es matantam, they offering the Rebbe a gift. Vehi, and the gift is hachlatasam, their resolution, lahoitzi la'oid chashbonam, to publish on their account with their expenses, their money, as cheile karishin, the first portion. Mean by what a dach of my modern of Chasidus, shehoyel kvei kedusha admor shlita la'amram, that the Rebbe was so kind as to say, b'meshach chomesh hashanim, during these 5 years, shalimatzei ba'atzei sabris, that he finds himself in the United States. V'yachad im zeh, and in conjunction with this, mabiyim heim tfilasam, Chasidim are offering their prayers. Ki yechazach et Hashem as b'riyusei, God Almighty should strengthen his health. V'yarech yomo v'shnoisav, and he should lengthen his days and his years b'teva in good, umasikus and sweetness. V'yanig es kol b'nei Yisrael b'chlal, he should lead all the Jewish people b'chlal. If you were here last class, that's what the whole idea was. The Rebbe b'de Welt, the Rebbe of the whole world. V'esanash b'frat, especially Chassidim, b'atzlach amarubu, with great success, ad boy Mashiach tzedkein, inu amet ha-Mashiach chamet meiri min amet. And it's signed, li'alta l'tshuva, li'alta l'giyula, that this is the famous slogan of the Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe, that if you do tshuva, Mashiach will come. Now if you look through the list, the first place anybody's going to look is by Menachem, right? You see Menachem Mendel ben Chana Schneerson. You know who that is? That's the Rebbe. And his name is there just like anybody else, nobody important. And the bottom, Schneerzalman ben Esther Gerari, is standing out because he was obviously the secretary of this initiative. But the Rebbe was the reason for this. The Rebbe wasn't just, the Rebbe made it all happen. They still had hate, the Rebbe don't think about it. But it was very, very important to the Rebbe that the Friedrich Rebbe shouldn't find out that he was behind it, because it would be the opposite of a Nachas Ruach. And this is one of the many things that happened at that point. And I want to discuss this amazing life, the Friedrich Rebbe's life of Mesiras Nefesh. And we're going to go back to page 1. Sefer Amarim Tov Shin. It's printed in a number of places, but I found that I was looking for it. So these pages, it looks easy when you collect it. It took me a while to find. It took me more time to find these sheets than just to teach the class. I mean, it's work. I don't have any regrets, but this isn't given. So we're going back to the beginning of the stack. Now I only made 20 copies, which means that I underestimated you. I should have made 30 English and 10 Hebrew. But it also means that you have to share. It's only reasonable. But the 20 copies here, there's not 100 people here. There's only 75 people here. My glasses make me see triple. But okay, I'm sorry. As long as you don't tell the boss. Okay, I understand. Okay, I got it. Now, you have to behave. Shh. Okay. Now, we're going to do page 2 at the bottom. You'll see I made all kinds of arrows. I'm going to do what I want anyway, but I made arrows here, arrows there, arrows going everywhere. Usually the arrows serve a purpose, but we're going to start on the bottom of page 2. Shnas Tofreish Nun Hey. You know what, let me preface. I'll tell you one word. The Rebbe, when the previous Rebbe passed away in 1915, Tafshin Yud, he passed away on Shabbos. Sunday was the funeral, was the Levaya. On Tuesday, the Rebbe turned around after davening. Tuesday, Yud Gimel Shvat, he turned around after davening and he said that the halacha is Shleisha L'Bchi and Shiva L'Hesped. That means to say when somebody passes away, for 3 days you cry, you mourn, and the remaining 4 days you eulogize. Now Chabad doesn't make eulogies, but the Rebbe said, I won't make a eulogy, but I'll tell stories. And the Rebbe proceeded to tell stories of the Rebbe the Shvef and the Friedrich Rebbe. All of these stories are published in Lekut Sichas Chelik Beis and the Sofas of Yud Shvat. They're also printed in the Sefer Maimor Basilagani Chelik Rishon and so on. It's been printed. You can find them. You want to find them, you can find them. They're translated into English and the whole situation. Sorry? The Kovetz Yud Shvat of Shalom Zayin, but it's been updated since then. The Sefer Maimor Basilagani is an improved version of that. And the Rebbe told stories. Some of them are very interesting. One of the stories was that the Rebbe Rashab once came back from a trip with a new cane, a walking stick, with a silver handle. Chassidish Rebbes, Shena Yidden, very, very beautiful Jews, walked around with a cane with a silver handle, and if they were even Shena, they walked around with a golden handle. Shena means they had more money in their wallet. But okay, so the Rebbe came back to Lubavitch with a walking stick with a silver handle. At that time, the previous Rebbe was about 16. And when he came home, he went into his wife, the Rebbe Tzishten Sarah, and he told her that I spent my last pennies on this walking stick. I gave him the letzte Geld of dem stecken. I gave him my last money. So she says to her husband, this stick is a luxury. Nobody needs it. I mean, it's a decoration. Why would you spend your last pennies on such a stecken when you can, the Friedrich is not going to disown you if you don't give him such a gift. So the Rebbe says to her husband, why would you spend your last pennies on such a gift? So the Rebbe Rashab answered, Ich hab sich erst it's der wusst wer is. He says to his wife, I just now discovered who he is. He was his father. And he raised him. And he raised him at a certain point. He raised him like there was nothing else in the world. The Rebbe Rashab at a certain point also said to his wife, when the Friedrich was 13 or 14, he says to his wife, I realize I have to raise him myself. No more tutors, no more teachers, I'm doing it myself. The previous Rebbe had a tutor from the time he was 11 or 12, a private tutor. After he was married a man already, he still had that tutor who learned with him and oversaw his ruchnistic progress. But at the same time, the Rebbe said, I have to raise him myself. So he says to his wife, I just discovered who he is. What happened was, the Rebbe traveled. The Rebbe Rashab traveled. And he met other Hasidic Rebbes and other Hasidic children. And he came home and said, boy, oh boy, oh boy, we have something special. He says to his wife, in other words, now that I've traveled, he said, I had to express my feelings. I don't know if you want to use the word affection. I think it's a lot deeper than that. But the Rebbe Rashab realized who the previous Rebbe was. It sounds like it took him a while, so to speak, to discover it. And he devoted himself. He put enormous amount of himself into his son in a very unusual way, because he knew that his son had the possibilities to achieve these great levels, and he knew also that the only one who could give it to him was himself. Now, just to give you a little bit of a history, when the Rebbe Rashab was growing up, he had two brothers around. He actually had a third brother who passed away, but he had two brothers. One was older than him. And his father, the Rebbe Marash, also raised him in a very special way, but they used to meet at 4:30 in the morning. So the other brothers had no idea that there was this special relationship. The one problem the previous Rebbe did not have was competition. He was a ben yachid. He was an only child. So the Rebbe devoted himself to Friedrich Rebbe extraordinarily. And one of the things that they would do was disappear from Lubavitch. The Rebbe used to go on vacation. What was vacation? Lubavitch was a big metropolis, with an airport and 2 television stations and 5 newspapers and who knows. Lubavitch was a hole in the wall. There was nothing going on in Lubavitch. Lubavitch didn't even have a train station. Lubavitch was a city of horses. And what comes along with horses, we'll leave it for your imagination. It was a little shtetl. And the Rebbe used to go on vacation. Every summer vacation. For 12 weeks, far from Shavuos till Rosh Hashanah. What's vacation? He wanted to be away from Chassidim. And the reason was because he wanted to spend time with the Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe. Let's read. Bottom of page 2. Shnas Tov Reish Nun Hey, that would be 1895. It was the first time Sha'avi Nosal and Eiv Desh, my father went on vacation. Hasiba Hagloya L'Nisiyasti Haisa, the official reason for the journey was Chalishas B'Yusei, he wasn't well. And frankly, he was a lot healthier then than he was in earlier years. But Ramasiba Mitis Haisa, the real reason was Sha'avi Ratzali Is Yachad Iti. My father wanted to spend time with me, Friedrich Rebbe says. And to be more dedicated my personal chinuch by himself. And then the Rebbe goes on to say, I had other teachers and they're all wonderful and they really, really did a great job. He lists his four. If you come to these classes regularly, you should know these teachers' names by heart. I've repeated it so many times. Rebbe Kosil was the Dardiki Malamed, Rebbe Shimshon was the Malamed who used to beat him up. And this is Kabbalah was the Chassidish Malamed. I've talked about it recently. And his last Malamed was a famous Chassid. He was really a private tutor. Reb Shmuel B'Tzalel Sheptel, the Rashbatz, who a generation earlier had been the tutor of his father. He raised 2 Rebbes. You imagine a Chassid who tutored 2 Rebbes to adulthood. They must have been something special, the Rashbatz. In spite of this, the Rebbe says, I have to raise him myself. The Rebbe Rashab has to raise him myself. So what happened was, right after Shavuos, they left. Every Monday they would come back to Lubavitch. Why did they come back on Mondays? I explained this to you recently. Because the Rebbe Rashab had a custom that once a week he went into his mother to spend some time. And this was his kibbud avayim. He would go into his mother for an hour or so. And he would sit and talk to her. And he would cook a samavar, a chainik, a urn of water. And there were other Hasidim would be invited. The Rebbe would already invite other Hasidim. And they would sit around and there would be cake and tea. And they would shmos. It was like a fabrengen. The Rebbe would sit at the head of the table, the Rebbe's mother. And the elder Chassidim would sit around with the Rebbe Rashab. It was like a fabrengen. And this was very important to the Rebbe Rashab. This was his kibbud avayim. And when he was away from Lubavitch, he would travel especially to Lubavitch just for the Monday morning tea with his mother and go back. The Rebbe says sometimes he would travel if he was out of the country. He'd get on a train, travel home to pour his mother a glass of tea and go back where he was. I mean, it was very important to him, this tea with his mother. So when they left Lubavitch to go to Noizdeshet, to the vacation house, from a big hole in the wall to a smaller hole in the wall, or there was more hole and less wall. I was once in a dacha in Peterburg. When I was in Russia 20 years ago, I was in a dacha. Oh my God. There were more mosquitoes than there were molecules of oxygen. You can't imagine. It was a disaster. But it was vacation. Don't ask. I don't know how anybody could have lived there, but I spent 2 Shabbos there. And I still remember the mosquitoes. I'm not talking about the mosquitoes that bit me. I'm talking about the mosquitoes that I ate with the cholent, you understand? Those, the ones that bit me, it was impossible. But that's vacation. It was outside Leningrad, the Chachas Sezon. Anyway, so they would come in every Monday. Yud Beis Tammuz that year, 1895, was Thursday. So Monday was Tes Tammuz, so they came in Monday for the regular visit. And then what happened was this: the Rebbe Rashab and the previous Rebbe used to take very, very long walks. They would take long, long walks. And during these walks they would talk. And these walks happened a lot. This is now the Rebbe is 15, around 15. When the Rebbe was already a grown man in his 30s and his 40s, and his father was out of the country, he would travel to see his father, and they would take 6-7 hour walks, and they would talk the whole time. And the Rebbe would later write down notes from these walks. A lot of the Maimorim of the previous Rebbe, which are really based on commentary of his father's Maimorim, or things that his father told him during these long walks. Imagine walking for 6-7 hours and speaking deep philosophy. I mean, no politics and no entertainment and no nonsense. Tifa skola about avoida. The Rebbe says, we would walk 6-7 hours a day, and in 2 or 3 weeks we'd cover a topic like Hashgacha Paratis. I mean, they would really delve really deep into it. You're talking about 2 great minds. The Rebbe Rashad, the Frierdiker Rebbe, were not just ordinary men. And now he was a 15-year-old boy, and they would take these long walks and they would talk. And he describes how his father prepared him for his birthday, how we should do tshuva on his birthday, and we should daven on his birthday, and so forth. And his father told him, tomorrow we're going to Lubavitch. It was Wednesday. He says, tomorrow we're going to go to Lubavitch. And they're going to be by the Oyhalim to ask Rachmanis, ask mercy of the Eibishter, that the chinuch and adracha that the Rebbe Rashab has given the Frierdiker Rebbe should be blessed with success. Thursday morning, before we left the vacation area, my father said to me, if you look on page 4, 3 paragraphs from the bottom, the middle line, it says, Hayim malu l'cha chamesh esrei shana. Today you have completed 15 whole years. HaMisper tezvav u'misper mechuba. The number 15 is very special. And afterwards, Nasati Ibavi Lubavitch, we traveled to Lubavitch. And when they were traveling, he also spoke a whole Indian. Last paragraph on page 4, please. The last paragraph on page 4. B'vayenu Lubavitch. We came to Lubavitch. Nasa Avi Kedaki Al Ime. The first thing my father did was he went to see his mother. Al Afsha Bikir Etzla Ka'amor V'yayim Sheni Kinei although he had already visited him on the Monday before, which was normal. When I said to my father that his grandmother, his father's mother, would be bewildered, be frightened by this surprise visit, Anali said, the Rebbe said to me, she's not going to be worried at all. He das. She knows. Which is very, very interesting. The Rebbe talked over with his mother. The Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe Rashab discussed, the truth is, the Frierdiker Rebbe said, he discussed even more with my mother, with his wife. The Rebbe Rashab's confidant was his wife. The Frierdiker Rebbe used to say about certain issues in his father's life, I had no idea this was going on, but my mother knew everything. The Rebbe Rashab would talk to his Rebbetzin about his avoided issues. The chinuch of the Frierdiker Rebbe he discussed at length with his mother. His mother was the Rebbetzin Rivkit. She was the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbetzin. She was the wife of the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe, the mother of the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, and the grandmother of the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the Rebbe Rashab had his mother fully apprised of who he figured his son was, and how he was raising him. And the Rebbetzin, his grandmother, was completely aware and involved in the fact that they were raising a Rebbe, a little boy, but a Rebbe. I told you the story recently with the Gattel. I'm not going to tell you the story of Gattel, how she prepared for him a Gattel, and she gave it to him to the previous Rebbe when he was 11. And he said to his grandmother, what's the meaning of this Gattel? So she said to me, I'm giving you a Gattel the way your grandfather gave your father a Gattel. But for the meaning, you'll have to go and ask your father. So he took this Gattel, the previous Rebbe was a silk Gattel, a gorgeous Gattel, and he ran to his father, he knocked on the door, and the Rebbe opened the door. The Rebbe Rashab opened his office, his door. The Rebbe Rashab usually referred to the Frierdiker Rebbe by his full name, Yosef Yitzchak. That's my name, Yosef Yitzchak. But he also had nicknames which he would use on occasion. I'm going to hang up on you if you talk. He had also nicknames. When he was in a good mood, he would say, "Vos machst Rabbi Yashe, Rabbi Yozel?" He had nicknames. So when the Rebbe opens, when the Frierdiker Rebbe knocked on the door, and his father opens the door with a big smile, his father, "Vos machst Rabbi Yashe? How are you?" So the Frierdiker Rebbe said, "I didn't say a word. I just held up the Gattel." As soon as my father saw the Gattel, his face became very serious. Tears appeared in his eyes. He kissed me on the forehead, and he took me into his room, and we closed the door. What they discussed is not in the Rishima, just that this kirov. And the Gattel was an Indian. Every Rebbe gave his successor a Gattel when they were a little boy. The story is that the Tzemach Tzedek gave his son a Gattel. So the Malamed said, "You have 7 children. How come you're giving only him?" So he said in Yiddish, "Ba uns is nitokin kashes, und auf uns is nitokin kashes. Die was verstehen, verstehen, die was verstehen nicht, verstehen nicht." That means in English, by us there are no questions, and on us there are no questions. Those who understand, understand, and those who don't understand, don't understand. Next generation, the Rebbe Maharash gave the Rebbe Rashab a Gattel, and the same Malamed who had been present when the Tzemach Tzedek gave the Rebbe Maharash a Gattel was now present how the son is giving the grandson a Gattel. And he says to the Rebbe Maharash, "How come you didn't give your older son the Gattel?" So he hears it word for word, like a tape. Bei uns ist Dokin Kashes und auf uns ist nicht Dokin Kashes. Die was verstehen, verstehen, die was verstehen nicht, verstehen nicht. By us there are no questions, and on us there are no questions. Those who understand, understand, and those who don't understand, don't understand. Now they're raising the next generation, the Frierdiker Rebbe. So the Baba, the grandmother, the grandfather was no longer alive, herself made, I don't know what the word is, she wove the Gattel out of silk. I don't know what the right word is, I'm not in that business. And she gave it to the Rebbe as soon as it was done. And she said to your father, "Pshat was the fragen beim Taten." The significance of this you'll ask your father. Anyway, getting back, this was when he was 11. Now he's 15. So he went to see his mother, and the Rebbe Rashab says to his son of Yev, "Don't worry. She knows more than you about what's going on." The Rebbe Tzedek was fully aware of the plans, the drama that was going to unfold on that day. My father went into the inner room, and I remained outside. And when he walked out, he said, "Now we're going to the Oyel." And the Rebbe and Rivka accompanied them. She went along, which is a strange thing. I mean, Lubavitch is a small little village. You could walk to the Oyel. It's not like Montefiore, you need to take a cab. It was a 10-minute walk, a 5-minute walk. She accompanied them with very, very hard tzedakah baruchas. Turn the page. When we read the holy oyalim of the Rebbe Maharash and Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek, we entered into the shul which was near the oyel. Now you have to remember, ladies and gentlewomen, the Lubavitcher Rebbe were not actors, you understand? They were not dramatists. They didn't do things for effect. What they did was serious. And when the Rebbe did something awesome, it was awesome. Listen to this story. Pasach Avi as Aaron HaKadosh V'Omen. The Rebbe Rashab goes over to the ark. He opens up the Aron Kadosh and the Sefer Torahs are visible, and he says, "Ani mevi hayoim es beni la'akeda." I'm bringing my son to the Akedah. Does anybody not know what the Akedah is? That's where Avraham Avinu took Yitzchak and he tied him on an altar. You understand? He took him off. But when he put him on the altar, he wasn't planning to take him off. He says, I'm bringing my son, I'm binding him to the Eivishter, like Avraham Avinu, ban Yitzchak to Avraham Avinu. Yesh oiked v'neaka. There is a tire and a tied, a binder and a bound. Avraham Avinu, alav Hashem, oked es Yitzchak b'nei. Avraham tied up his son. Kedei shaliyah be'psul chas v'sholem. He shouldn't have any wounds, any blemishes. V'gamani reita. I wish Akedah tiyeh kefi haretzuya. At the Akedah, the binding of my son should be kosher. Avi poratz b'bchi amuk. The Rebbe says, my father burst into tears and he's sobbing. Ani le'yadaiti oz. At that point, I still had no idea mishum davar from anything. And I didn't know yet what my father had in mind. You see a man cry, you cry along. I mean, if your father is the Rebbe Rashab and the son of the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, I guess it's not that difficult. Afterwards, Lomad Avi Iti. My father learned with me. Liyad Aron HaKadosh HaPasuach. The Aron HaKadosh was still open. Chatzi Peri B'geres HaKadosh D'Beramas Al Chag Rebbeis Masneh. It's the first B'geres HaKadosh, which talks about the Inyan from Agartl. Chag Rebbeis the Inyan from Agartl. And you must understand that the significance of Agartl, the whole Maimed, the whole B'geres HaKadosh is that the person's body is divided into three parts. There's the head, and the heart, and the thighs, the lower third. The gartel is on the lower third of the body, the masnayim. So it says in Tanya that the thighs, the pelvis, are the lowest part of the body, but they hold up the whole body. And the nimshal is halacha, Jewish law, is the lowest part of Torah. It's not as scholarly, it's not as rich and enlightening as Lomdus and as Chassidus and Kabbalah, but it holds up the whole structure. And in other words, the thighs, the masnayim, goes on Kabbalah Sel Machashamayim, or, as I once heard from a mashpia of mine, the other side of the coin of Kabbalah Sel Machashamayim is Mesiras Nefesh. Or the other side, Mesiras Nefesh is on one side of the coin and Kabbalah Sel is on the other side. Just a machlekes, which is heads and which is tails, and I'm making a joke. Please don't get serious with it. Okay. Upane Elaivi Amr, then the Rebbe says to his son, Bifneim Shalaveis HaKodesh, in the presence of our holy fathers, Ani Reitze Lichis Itcha Bris, I wish to make with you a covenant. Avi Hemed As Oisi Mulai, he stood facing me. Hiniach Yodav Hagedeshes Alai, he put his holy hands on my head. Va'amar, and he said, the Rebbe is 15. Mehayim, starting today. Ani Moisa B'Yotcha, I'm giving to you as Havaida Ba'askanas HaKlal, the work of community service. B'inyanim Gashmim Beruchni, both about the material needs of the Jewish nation and the spiritual needs of the Jewish nation. And in conjunction with the Tanya that they learned about the idea of the masnayim, the thighs that support the whole body, that's even from Kabbalah Seil and Amun and Mesiras Nefesh. He said, the beginning of serving Hashem is the thighs. And the inyan from the thighs is, like I said before, Kabbalah Seil and Amun and so on. After you have a healthy pelvis, you can have a healthy heart and a healthy mind. Masnayim tzricham l'chagura. The thighs, the pelvis needs a girdle, a belt. V'chagura hi oiz, chag rabbi oiz, and the belt is oiz, is might, is power. Oiz zehu mesiras nefesh. The girdle that supports the pelvis of avoida, which comes before the heart and the mind, is mesiras nefesh. This is a father loving his 15-year-old. I have a 15-year-old. I guess I don't love him that much. Umesiras nefesh, the meaning of mesiras nefesh is haynu kach v'lei acheres, azoi unit adesh, like this and no other way. And then the Rebbe explained it to him. Then in the next paragraph it says, my father went into the oil. This was in the shul in front of the oil. My father went into the oil, and I stood outside, the Frierdiker Rebbe says. And I'm saying Tillim, and the Rebbe Rashab cried a storm. He cried, you could think the world came to an end. And I guess the Rebbe Rashab didn't know the world came to an end. He knew the world was going to come to an end, you understand? The Rebbe Rashab took a little boy who should have been learning and davening day and night and made him a public servant at 15, because the Rebbe Rashab saw the future. He knew what he was leaving for his son, the Frierdiker Rebbe. And the Frierdiker Rebbe needed this much chinuch to prepare himself for the generation of Mesiras Nefesh that would be his. And his father cried bitterly, and I was out of my mind. I know what's going on. Third line of the next paragraph. In the interim, my father opens the door. That separates the shul from the oil. Told me to come into the oil. Though I had visited the oil with my father many times before. First of all, on my bar mitzvah date 2 years earlier, he had been with his father to the oil many times. When I walked into the oil that day, I was overwhelmed. Frierdiker Rebbe says, he was 15. He kones amali avi. My father said, come in. Va'avi saboch. My father, your grandfather, Reb Marash. Va'asabe, my grandfather, your great grandfather, Rabbi Tzemach Tzedek, Yuvarchu Eisach Haniv Brachas. Now you must understand, I'm not going to beat around the bush. The Rebbe Rashab came to the oil, and he spoke to his father and his grandfather, and they connected. They spoke back. And now he says to the Frierdiker Rebbe, I've opened the line of communication, come on in. I want you to communicate with your Zayd and your Elter Zayd of Emes. I was filled with unbelievable awe and fear. I stood motionless, like stone. I couldn't move. And finally, I was able to calm down and enter. My father lit 72 candles. 72 candles, I don't know what's the cheshbon. He brought me close to the kvarim. Some Yadav HaKadeshes. HaKadeshes is the beginning of a line. Al Reish, he put my hand on his head. And he gave me a bracha. When I heard the emotional crying, the inner felt tears shalavi. I saw the tears dripping from his eyes onto the floor. I was very deeply moved. I was extremely deeply moved. Okay? They went back to the grandmother. The Rebbe Rashab clearly wanted to tell his mother what happened. He told his mother before what he was going to do. And now he returned to his mother to tell him what had occurred. And Kidei Shetanik Liba as Berachas says the Rebbetzin also benched the previous Rebbe. And then they went back to the dacha, to this vacation that they were on. It's the end of vacation. Now I want you to turn the page 7 and 8. Okay, now this is most interesting. Most interesting. Because what you have here is a real concise, an abbreviated overview of the history of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's public service. And I'm reading at the bottom of page 7. My 15th birthday. Mina oisi avi, my father appointed me lemaskiri hasedi v'aprati, to his private and secret secretary, ba'askana sakal, in public service. I told you the story recently, for those who are regulars here, that when the Rebbe was about 16 or 17, Frierdiker Rebbe, he didn't have much of a beard, you understand. I have a beard because I'm a couple of times 16. But the Rebbe was a little boy, he was a bacher. He barely had a few hairs on his chinny chin, you understand. And the Rebbe Rashab couldn't go to a meeting that was extremely important because of health. So he sent the Frierdiker Rebbe. Now who was by this meeting? The Slonim Rebbe, who was a very big shutef of the Rebbe Rashab in all Haskanas Tiburis. The Slonim Rebbe fell in love with the Rebbe Rashab. It's a whole long story. Reb Chaim Brisker, the greatest of the Litvische Gedalim at that time, and others, maybe the Chafetz Chaim. I mean, really great, the greatest of Jews of Russia of that time, and they were great, they were truly great. And a 16-year-old Bacher, you understand? So it didn't look right. So the Rebbe Rashab sent the Frierdiker Rebbe with a chaperone. And the chaperone had a beautiful beard and long eyelashes. He looked mamish like a tzaddik. It was the Rashbatz, the Rebbe's tutor, who was in fact a very big chassid. You know the Rashbatz? The Rashbatz used to say that he was by the Baal Shem Tov's tzion, and he was mishtateach. He did what you have to do until he saw the Baal Shem Tov awake. He saw the Baal Shem Tov while he was awake, not in a dream. He physically saw him. So the Rashbatz said, "Negevenken kind." You imagine a Jew should say, a Jew who lived, he passed away in 1905, a chassid, that he was by the Baal Shem Tov's tzion. The whole reason why this happened, he had made a very big mistake, and he was trying to correct it. So he was mishtatech al kivish al Baal Shem Tov, busy chagezende Baal Shem Tov b'hakis, not in a dream. And he knew he wasn't hallucinating, and he knew it was the real thing. He saw the Baal Shem Tov, Rashbatz. And he was not a child. He was in his 70s for sure. And the Rebbe Rashab sent him along with the Frierdiker Rebbe to this meeting of prominent Rabbonim, so it should look good. Right before they left Mamish, they're about to leave Lubavitch, the Rebbe Rashab suddenly calls in the Rashbat, the tutor. And he says to him, "Herr, du sollst wissen, als ich schick was weniger, du wirst sich mischen als besser." That means I want you to know, I'm sending that 16-year-old boy, not you. And the less you intervene, the better it'll be. When the Rebbe Rashab understood that the Frierdiker Rebbe 15, 16, 95, it's all saints, Ananda Mitzias, the Rebbe Frierdiker Rebbe belonged by a meeting of Gedolei Yisrael in spite of his youth. And the Rebbe used his son. He exploited him. He used him. Chassidim used to complain to the Rebbe Rashab that he's taking too much advantage of his son. Could you imagine? Chassidim, you say to the Rebbe, how do you do this to your son? It's not fair. He's your son. Give him some space. Everybody knew that he's going to be a successor. He had no life. Nicht zu lernen und nicht zu davenen. So the Rebbe Rashab said that for Astonis Tiburis you have to have Mesiras Nefesh. Muftachani, I'm sure, as vet Meirach Yamim Zayin. He'll live long. He lived till 70. And if you know anything about the Frierdiker Rebbe's life, that was impossible. The Rebbe said that when he was 53 years old, the doctors had no idea how he lived. He lived 17 years on miracles. But this was the Rebbe, the Rashab, the way, and he wasn't Chas V'Shalom exploiting the Rebbe. He was raising him. Apparently, the Rebbe Rashab saw very well the cataclysm that was going to happen to the Jewish world, and he was giving his son all of the skills necessary to deal with that cataclysm, which meant that he couldn't afford to live normal, even though the world was still normal. He had to be preempted, he had to be prepared. So his father raised him mamish on a diet of Mesiras Nefesh from the age of 15 years old. And what happens is like this: B'shas hatil, during our strolls, our walks, Sakar b'fanai b'ktsara, my father reviewed for me briefly Esmeya v'arbaim shneis, the 140 years ad until that point of Askanas Haklal, of public service, shall Nesiyei Chabad of the Rebbeim. And the Rebbe goes through a whole list. How the Alter Rebbe was involved in Askanas Saburis when he was 11. The Moshe, the Alter Rebbe's son, writes that he knew people who knew the Alter Rebbe when he was a little boy. And you know what he did when he was 11 years old? He helped people start businesses. The Alter Rebbe was for bar mitzvah. And he helped people with panos. I mean, he was a very ingenious child. He was a very capable, resourceful child. But he understood what married life is like, in spite of the fact that he was a boy. And he helped people with panos. And then he goes on to talk, Bariches, the Rebbe has 4 or 5 paragraphs about the Alter Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh, the Middle Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh, the Tzemach Tzedek's Mesiras Nefesh, and the Rebbe Marash's Mesiras Nefesh, and so forth. Then it says, on page 8, 1 paragraph above the arrow, 1 paragraph above the arrow, Achrei Hatzor Shel Arba Shoyz, my father talked for 4 hours, Be'inyan Askanas Rosi Chabad, the public service of the Rebbeim, Omad Ovi al Raglav, my father stood up on his feet. Ubarcheni bebirchas Mazel Tov, and he gave me a bracha of Mazel Tov. No, thank you. Al Knisasi ba'avedas haskonas haklal, my entering into the service of being a public person. And then the Rebbe writes, listen to these words: Bilahav eish shalev tsoyer, with the flaming fire of a young heart. Ani maftiach la'avi, I promised my father, I agreed, I acquiesced. Shani Moiser as Kol Kuli. I'm devoting myself entirely. Lirshusay to his domain. Ubechol Gufi v'nafshi, my whole body and my whole soul. Ashlim be'ezer Hashem Yisborach, I will see to carry out with Hashem's help. Ba'achloti is gemuras with absolute certainty. Kol ma sheyim suruli levateya, everything I'm going to be given to do. Ba'askanas haklal in public service. And on that occasion, my father already gave me his first instructions of what he wished from me. A 15-year-old boy. Now, no Rebbe had such a thing. No Rebbe, no Lubavitcher Rebbe comes near this kind of sacrifice. The Rebbe Rashab was 22 years old, 21 years old, almost 22 when his father passed away. The Rebbe Rash. First of all, his father never included him in the public service. The Rebbe Marash was one of the most active of the Rabbeim in terms of public service. His son sat and learned daven day and night. He didn't know what was flying in the world. The Rebbe Rashab could not read and write Russian. Could you imagine? A Rebbe, a leader. He was completely isolated. When his father passed away, he was in total shock and complete lack of preparedness. He had no preparation. His father passed away early. His father was supposed to live a few more years. It's a whole story. The Rebbe took 11 years to raise himself. The Rebbe Rashab did not assume the succession of his father for 11 years after his father passed away. He was preparing himself for the job. In Das Tachten, now he's raising his son and he's stealing his childhood from him. 15 years old. And he makes him a public servant. And what it meant was, Rebbe Rashab heard plenty of tzaras. Every correspondence that came to the Rebbe, his 15-year-old boy was apprised of, was aware of, and he worked hand in hand. And you understand what this means. The previous Rebbe's ability to keep a secret was adult. It was like a very deep maturity. He wasn't 15. He was a man. He was a great man in spite of his youth. And the Rebbe realized that he has a son, a ish, a mensch, and he used him for the needs that he had, but more importantly, he was raising him preparing him for the generation which he would be left to take care of, which was one of the worst generations in the history of the Jewish people. I read in a Belzer Sefer, if you don't mind me mentioning the Belzer Rebbes, and if you do mind, I'm going to mention them anyway, so you might as well not mind. The Belzer Rebbes were very big tzaddikim, they were very holy men. The Friedrich Belzer, the Battle of Belzer, was born the same year as the previous Rebbe, 1880. Both of them were Rebbe for 30 years, exactly. The difference was when it started. The Rebbe Rayatz became a Rebbe in 1920. And the Heilige Belzer, the Battle of Belzer, became a Rebbe in 1927. So the Rebbe passed away in 1950, and the Belzer Rebbe passed away in 1957. He was a Rebbe for 30 years. By his father's funeral, the Battle of Belzer cried. This is 1927. It's about 10 years after the World War I. Tata avosar adoras the mirgalos. He cried, he sobbed. Father, why did you leave me such a generation? How could you leave me such a generation? These people knew them verstanden sehr gut. They understood well. They saw with their holy eyes, the tzuras. That generation, from before World War I till after World War II, you find a period in history that equals it. You find. There have been such periods. What were they called? The Asians, the Mongolians who came through Europe. What were they called? No. The Tatars, I think they're called. Yeah, right. They destroyed Europe. They destroyed Europe. They killed millions of people. And in one generation they were gone. They immediately the Welt. That's a moment in history that equals the world wars. The world wars the world is completely different because of those two wars and its aftermath. Alexander the Great, Alexander of Macedonia, and the revolution he made was equal. We have lived through, our parents have lived through one of the most difficult periods in the history of humankind, let alone the Jewish people. And for Jews it's been hell. And the Rebbe Rashab raises his 15-year-old boy to shepherd that generation. It's not fun. It ain't fun at all. But he's going to give him whatever resources he could possibly give, whatever koiches, Whatever preparation there could be, he's going to provide him. Okay, now. And now the story goes on. We've got to stop, I guess, at a certain point. So on page 9, okay, there's a few more points. Let me say this. When the Rebbe Rashab passed away in 1920, I guess it was March of 1920, his passing away was in itself a very, very, very remarkable and dramatic event. As you all know, I reckon, the Friedrich Rebbe's father, the Rebbe Rashab, lived 59 years. For a good portion of those years, he was extremely ill, so sick that the doctors wrote him off twice or 3 different times. But his illnesses were mostly in his earlier years. In his later years, the Rebbe Rashab was much healthier. When the Rebbe Rashab was in his 30s, and his 40s, and his 50s, he was much healthier than he had been in his 20s and his early 30s. That's a fact. Doesn't make sense, but that's a fact. The previous Rebbe told Chassidim after his father passed away, "Beim Taten is gesund, die letzte Zeit gewesen nicht kosher." The recent times, my father was pretty healthy. Purim of that year, there was a Farbrengen. It was right after the Bolsheviks came into Rostov. And the Rebbe Rashab decided at midnight that he's going to make believe there's no revolution, there's no Bolsheviks, there's no nothing. And he started to speak about the Bolsheviks. Well, he had a very deep hatred for the Bolsheviks. And he said it in their presence. And he cursed them up and down. The Friedrich Rebbe was in a fright. He was very, very upset. And his father said, "No, they don't exist. They're nothing. I'll say Chasidus, they'll vanish altogether." He said a maimed. And there were no repercussions. They didn't arrest the Rebbe. Nothing happened. This was Thursday night. Sunday morning early, the Rebbe Rashab calls in his secretary to go get him Sfarim. He had no Sfarim. His library was in Moscow. And it's still in Moscow. We're still trying to get that library. So he sent one of his maskidim to bring him a whole list of Sfarim, which he told him to bring. The Rebbe locked himself in his room, and everybody saw that Rebbe was preoccupied. Nobody knew with what. And in that week, the Rebbe Rashab wrote his will, his savor. The will of the Rebbe Rashab is very, very, very long, very, very, very scholarly. It's very, very intellectual. It's very scholarly. And nobody has ever seen it. The Friedrich Rebbe published one page of his will, which was Negea L'Rabim, that was for public consumption. The Rebbe Rashab's will has not been seen to date. It's in the library. But it's a very long scholarly will. A very, very deep scholarly will. What he was writing in that will, I have no clue. But nobody has ever seen that will. It's a secret. I don't know why. The will was written between Sunday and Friday. Friday night, the Rebbe Rashab did not feel well. The following Saturday night, he passed away. And when you read the story, you mamish see a man writing his own ticket. The Bolsheviks came into Rostov. The Rebbe Rashab made this statement in public. "I can't live with these people." He wrote his will. He got sick. Boop, checked out. You read the book. The story of his passing is recorded in a tremendous, tremendous emotion. Because it was recorded by somebody who was in the house at the time, who wrote it as it was happening. So the emotion is so real. The Chassid who wrote it, Rebbe Rifkin, Ashkafta the Rebbe, you can buy it in a bookstore. It's an amazing piece of Hasidic work because there's so much Hasidic neshama in it because it was written literally as the events were unfolding. And you watch the Rebbe deteriorate in a week. They asked him to bring a doctor. He says, "You want to bring a doctor? Bring a doctor." But his body language was, "You're wasting your time. I decided and that's it." I mean, it was mamish. It was a histalkus. A Rebbe, he doesn't want to live, he's not going to live, that's all. And he left the Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe, with one of the worst generations of history. So the story is that on Saturday night, Motzei Shabbos, night he passed away, Beis Nissen, at about midnight, the Rebbe was very ill, he was burning up with fever. And you must remember, how quickly this is 1 week. A healthy man is now on his deathbed. And this is not a man, this is a Rebbe. And Hasidim don't know where to put themselves. They're climbing the walls. It was like no warning. It was so quick. The Rebbe opens his eyes, Libra Shab, and he says, Ich gehe in Himmel, de Ksavim la sich mit euch. Nehmt mir in Saal, weil mir sein in einem. That means, I am going into the heavens, but I'm leaving you my Chasidus. And the Rebbe always used to say, I'm leaving you myself in my Chasidus. Take me to the Beis Medrash, to the shul, so we'll be all together. So they carried his bed from the bedroom into the shul. And all of the Chassidim were together with the Rebbe b'shas de Histalpus, which just tells you the kind of relationship the Rebbe Rashab had with his Chassidim, the Tmimim. Several hundred men. They were pushed in the room, and they bought that building, and that shul, that room is now again a shul, and the spot where the Rebbe's bed was, there were people alive, there's people still alive, who were there at the time, and recall vividly that day. Reb Zalman Garari was there. Reb Zalman Garari was Mistama Bar Mitzvah at that point. He was a big boy. Reb Mendel Morozov was a child. He was 4. But Reb Zalman Garari was already past Bar Mitzvah Mistama. Samach Zayin he was born. He was there, B'Shas Maaseh. He was there. And they put a fence around that spot where the Rebbe's bed was afterwards, naturally. And the Rebbe Rashab was nostalgic with his Chassidim. They all said Knishma with him. It's the emotion, the drama is... And the governing his own last, people don't get to pick how they die, you understand? This was a man who wrote his own script to the minutiae. So they carried him into the Beis Medrash, and he's laying in his bed. It was about 2:30 in the morning. He's so ill. His eyes are closed. He's very pale. And at a certain point, the Vedic Rebbe couldn't control himself, and he became hysterical. He just lost it. Berel Rifkin describes, the author of this book, Askata the Rebbe, describes how the Vedic Rebbe walked out of the room for a minute, and he grabs this Berel Rifkin, he grabs him and he shakes him. He says, Berel, where are we? We have no heart. We have no emotion. They were numb. He walked into the room, he says, and at a certain point, the Vedic Rebbe became hysterical. He lost it. And the Rebbe opens his eyes. The Rebbe Rashab opens up his eyes. And he says to his son, the Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe, his spoilers, moichin. I don't know the tone, I wasn't there. So I'm just assuming. His spoilers means emotion, so much emotion. The mind. In other words, you have to be in control. And the Rebbe would say later that those words changed him. He became a new person. His father gave him the ability to control his emotions at that point. Those are the last words of the Rebbe said in his life. He smiled, he closed his eyes, and this was it. This was the Histalpus. This is the way a Rebbe raises a Rebbe. The Friedrich Rebbe becomes a Rebbe, and he starts to do what his father told him to do, to teach Hasidus. Within a year and a half, he realizes that the Jewish world in Russia is burning to the ground. It's hard for us to try to understand what it means. Russia had millions of Jews. There were more Jews in Russia than any place else in the world. And 20 years before, the vast majority of those Jews were from. 20 years after, the vast majority of those Jews were atheists. Think about what a turnaround. Think about the speed in which this revolution happened. These were unfortunately Jews who ripped the soul out of the Jewish people. And the Rebbe stood like a lion fighting them himself. So he describes on page 9 the arrows that I made. Vishnas Tofresh Pei Beis in 1922, Mesaper Rebbe, the Rebbe relates, Hitasvu b'Moskva Tisha mitalmidei atmimim. 9 of the Talmidim of the yeshiva gathered in Moscow, Varabi v'Torah Siri, and the Rebbe was the 10th, Taraminyan. V'nishba'u, and they swore over a Sefer Torah. Limsed es nafshal malhabatzas Torah, to sacrifice their lives to the dissemination of Torah, ad tipas hadam acher, until the last drop of blood will leave their bodies. Kol echad me'anasaf, from each one of the assembled, Kibal al-Atzmei took upon himself chelik me'aveda, close part of this work, sheikifas cholarach ve'amedina, which encompassed all of Russia. And of course, 5 years later was the year of the Rebbe's arrest. And I just want to show you from that Purim. There's so much to read. You take it home and read it. I just want to show you 2 lines. One is on page 13. This is Purim 1927. Purim 1927. I underlined the words. And the Rebbe used to say again and again, the Rebbe drank a lot of mashka, the Rebbe did, he chalash, he fainted in the middle of the fabrengen. And at a certain point, he kept on saying again and again, Kishetiru shahaguf boyer, when you'll see this body burning, al terachamu, have no mercy. Shimru asaresh, guard the head, heat the cup. This is Rabbi Chaim. Rabbi Chaim writes this in his Yeshimas. You'll see this body burning, don't have mercy, guard the head. And the head meant the children. The head meant Tashbad. In the Rebbe's Yeshimas, the Frierdiker Rebbe's own account of this Fabrengen, he says, as der guf brennt, you see this body burning, don't stop teaching children Torah. Now, turn to page 16, and this is a jolt. This paragraph, it just blows your mind. The Rebbe was walking out of this Fabrengen Purim, and he meets a Jew from the city of Neville, whose name was Zalman. And he says, Zalman, they'll make a fire out of dry wood. They'll tell you, pick one of the following. Either give your children to the schools where they teach heresy, or throw yourself into this fire. Do you know what to do? Throw yourself into this fire. Do not give your children the day they should raise your kids. This is a Rebbe. A Rebbe is a nice man. He's not Bin Laden, you understand? He doesn't celebrate death. He celebrates life. But this was a time of Mesiras Nefesh, and the Rebbe made himself into a living torch. The Rebbe, the Yatz, was not planning to survive. When he stood up to the Russians, it was in his mind clear that they're going to kill him. There was no doubt. Read the writings, read the letters and the sikhs. He didn't have some kind of grand plan that he's going to sneak out at the last minute. His Hasidim would be saved. It worked out that way. But he was a living torch of Mesiras Nefesh, and Yidden followed. And this was all that chinuch, those 25 years, from the age of 15 to the age of 40 that his father gave him, where he mamish again and again encouraged his own son to risk his life to help Jews. Not only beruchnias, sometimes also begashmias. And we'll stop now. Take this home and read it. 55 years of Mesiras Nefesh. Without wissen that the koiches and the brachas and the effect of all of this Mesiras Nefesh we have. And the Eibishter should help us, and we should succeed in each one of us in our own little way to make our corner of the world what the Eibishter wants it to be, and that Mashiach should come now, mamish. Okay, a guten Yom Tov and Kol Tov.